Rain pressed itself against the city like a suffocating shroud, each droplet carving its own cold path down the warped glass of the apartment window. The neon outside glared through the streaks, pale blue, sickly pink, a pulse that never matched the rhythm of a living heart. In this city, the night was a second skin, slick with secrets, and the streets below ran with reflections that twisted everything familiar into something unrecognizably sinister. Every footstep echoed with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was always listening, always watching. There were no shadows here, only the gaudy, lurid light and the stains it couldn't quite conceal. Inside the room, the air clung to the walls, thick with the metallic scent of old blood and rain-soaked concrete. The desk was a battlefield of crumpled notes, faded photographs, and message fragments, each one a wound, each one a promise of answers that never quite arrived. The city's voice was the drip of water in darkened hallways, the static hiss of broken radios, the low moan of the wind funneling through alleys. Out there, beneath the constant drizzle, someone was writing a story in flesh and fear, and all I could do was chase after the smeared ink, hoping the next word wasn't my own name. I had been chasing this killer for weeks, or maybe years. The calendar on the wall told only lies. The days smeared into each other, like the faces I passed on the street. Every clue I uncovered was a piece of a puzzle that seemed to change shape as soon as I touched it. The messages left behind, scratched into bathroom mirrors, painted in phosphorescent streaks on underpass walls, whispered through payphone static, were never answers, never even questions. They were reflections of my own confusion, warped and thrown back at me with a cruel, knowing smile. Every time I thought I had caught the thread, it unraveled, and I was left with only the sensation of falling through someone else's nightmare. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought visions that clung to me long after I woke. I would see myself in places I didn't remember, hands stained with something darker than rainwater, faces looming out of the fog that I recognized but could not name. Sometimes I heard footsteps following me, measured and relentless, always, just out of sight. Other times, I caught glimpses of myself in windows, distorted by the rain, a stranger's eyes looking back, hollow and hungry. The city itself seemed to conspire, its buildings leaning in, its streets looping back on themselves, as if guiding me somewhere I was never meant to find. What drove me wasn't justice, at least not anymore. It was something rawer, older, a need to understand the shape of the darkness that moved through these streets. The killer was clever, yes, but more than that, they understood the city's language, the way truth could be bent and shattered, how reality itself could be rewritten. With enough fear and enough blood, every step I took, every message I deciphered, only led me deeper into a labyrinth of uncertainty. I felt my grip on the world slipping, memory twisting around itself, days rewinding, words rearranging. Nothing stayed fixed. Even the rain, once a comfort, now sounded like a warning, a code I could almost understand, but never quite break. Tonight, another message waited. I could feel it in the bone-deep ache that settled in my chest as I pulled on my coat and stepped into the liquid neon. The city pressed in, alive and hungry, every shadow a threat, every light a lie. I moved, not with hope, but with the cold determination of someone who knows there is no turning back. The hunt had changed me, hollowed me out, filled me with the killer's own uncertainty. Every answer I sought was a step further from the truth, another stone in the wall that separated me from myself. In the wet, endless night, I wondered if I was hunting the killer, or if the killer was hunting me, or if, in the end, there was any difference at all. The night's air carried the subtle tang of ozone, a sharpness that seemed to set nerves on edge without warning. Each intersection I crossed revealed a new tableau of the city's hidden life. A woman sheltering under a broken awning, her eyes flicking up with a wary calculation. A figure clutching a plastic bag, shuffling past puddles that reflected a world no one believed in anymore. These moments, fleeting and easily dismissed by most, became signposts for me. A language of unease, spoken in glances and hurried silences. In this city, suspicion wasn't a passing cloud, but a fixture, as permanent as the stains on the sidewalk. What's fascinating is how the mind adapts to this environment, how every gesture or phrase is dissected, its intent weighed against the possibility of deceit or danger. You start to notice patterns that might not exist, reading malice into the mundane, and before long, trust becomes a relic. Even so, when I entered the small, fluorescent-lit convenience store at the corner of Ash and Mercer, the sense of scrutiny sharpened. The clerk, a gaunt man with eyes too bright for the hour, watched every movement with the patience of someone waiting for a story to unfold. The radio behind him mumbled a weather report, but the words dissolved into static the moment. I focused on them. I glanced at the security mirror, warping my reflection into a stranger, and realized how quickly the familiar could mutate into something untrustworthy. This subtle shift, how comfort becomes threat, underscored every interaction. Now, imagine standing in a crowd where every face is a cipher and every smile might hide a snare. You feel the urge to retreat, yet the pull of the mystery drags you deeper, demanding that you pass each encounter for hidden meaning. Moving through the aisles, I found myself drawn to the notice board cluttered with dog-eared flyers and cryptic postings. One note, written in sharp, elegant script, announced a lost cat with eyes that see too much. Another, more sinister, was composed of letters cut from newspapers. You are being watched. These fragments, seemingly trivial, gained weight in an atmosphere already thick with anxiety. They became part of the city's private lexicon, a dialogue of threat and longing that only the truly desperate could understand. It's here that the sense of being known and unknown at once becomes its own form of torment. The boundaries between observer and observed blur, and you begin to question your own motives. Are you searching for answers, or simply feeding a need to feel significant in a narrative you can't control? Beyond the glow of the store, the rain had settled into a steady, relentless patter, drumming against the trash bins and gutters. The sound became a metronome for my thoughts, forcing a rhythm onto anxieties that might otherwise spiral. Yet, with every step back into the street, I felt the ground tilt slightly, as if the city itself meant to unbalance me. Streetlights flickered, casting after images that danced at the edge of vision, and somewhere nearby, a car backfired, jolting my heart into my throat. It's in these moments, when the external world mirrors internal disquiet, that you realize how easily reality can be bent. The evidence you gather, the clues you chase, are filtered through a mind already primed to expect betrayal. Even the most mundane detail, a torn piece of paper, a half-heard phrase, acquires a sinister gravity. The city whispers, but the message is always slippery, just out of reach. Ultimately, this labyrinth of uncertainty doesn't just challenge your judgment. It erodes the very foundation of perception. You begin to second-guess not only the motives of others, but the reliability of your own senses. Memory morphs, details shift, and the line between vigilance and paranoia thins to transparency. In the end, the city's secrets aren't simply hidden, they're actively hostile, reshaping themselves each time you draw near. When certainty dissolves, every answer is just another riddle, and every revelation tightens the snare. Stepping further into the city's underbelly, the architecture itself seemed to betray a different sort of logic, one that cared nothing for conventional order. Buildings leaned at impossible angles, their facades peeling like old scabs, and windows glared with a jaundiced light that flickered as if in silent communication with something unseen. Here, The city's physical decay was more than mere neglect. It suggested a purposeful unraveling, as if some unseen hand were undoing reality's seams. In this shifting landscape, each step became a wager, a tacit agreement to risk one's sense of balance for the hope of finding stable ground. The alleys pulsed with a life of their own, breathing out warm, fetid air that carried ghostly snatches of laughter and argument, only to swallow them just as quickly. The world here was not only distorted, it was actively hostile to coherence. Against this backdrop, the city's denizens moved with a peculiar tension, as though aware of the invisible currents shaping their fates. Unlike the anonymous faces glimpsed at a distance, these people carried their secrets openly, etched into the set of their shoulders or the nervous flick of their eyes. Take, for instance, the man hunched over a chessboard set atop a crate, his fingers trembling as he nudged a pawn forward. His opponent, a gaunt woman with a perpetual half-smile, seemed less interested in the game than in the ritual of its play, her gaze darting past him toward the darkness beyond the pool of light. Their movements were stiff, mechanical, as though following some script too old and too cruel to be remembered consciously. It was in these moments, crystallized in the amber of shared paranoia, that the true nature of the city's madness revealed itself. The rules of engagement had shifted. Every interaction now bore the weight of silent accusation. What complicates matters even further is the city's uncanny ability to manipulate time. Hours bled into one another, distinctions between late night and early morning dissolving beneath the constant drizzle. A walk that should have taken minutes stretched on endlessly, with clocks stubbornly refusing to advance or at times spinning backward in mockery. This temporal dislocation fostered a sensation akin to drifting in a fever dream, where cause and effect were suggestions rather than certainties. Now picture yourself pausing beneath a streetlight, only to realize you've stood in that precise spot before. Same puddle, same cigarette butt, same echo of a distant siren. The realization that you are looping, perhaps endlessly, plants a seed of dread that flourishes with alarming speed. In such an environment, memory becomes unreliable, and every attempt to anchor oneself only serves to further undermine confidence in one's perceptions. Adding yet another dimension, the city's sounds began to coalesce into patterns that hovered on the edge of meaning. The low hum of machinery beneath the streets, the syncopated drip from a fire escape, the shuddering clang of a distant train. These noises formed a subterranean language that seemed tailored to each listener's anxieties. Occasionally, a phrase would surface in the static, half heard and half imagined, but always suffused with a sense of deliberate menace. The city did not simply contain secrets, it broadcast them, wrapping each resident in a cocoon of cryptic communication. The effect was one of perpetual anticipation, as though the next sound, the next flicker of light, might finally unveil the truth, only to dissolve into deeper ambiguity. Altogether, this relentless barrage of sensory distortion and shifting reality forced a confrontation with the limits of reason. The city refused to yield to rational inquiry. Every attempt at understanding was met with a new layer of enigma. The boundaries between the external world and internal experience frayed, and the mind, stripped of its anchors, became a maze as treacherous as the streets themselves. Here, the pursuit of certainty was not merely futile. It was a catalyst for further descent, a siren song that lured the unwary ever closer to the brink. A new complication crept in with the discovery of a battered notebook left conspicuously on a bench outside a boarded-up theater. Its cover was damp, curling at the corners, but the pages inside were untouched by rain, filled with jagged handwriting and cryptic diagrams. As I flipped through it, each entry read like a fragment of someone else's life. half-formed confessionals, lists of names crossed out with violent strokes, directions to places that seemed to shift location as soon as I tried to map them in my mind. The words hummed with a feverish energy, suggesting not only obsession, but intent. What unsettled me most was the sense that the thoughts inside the notebook didn't originate from a single consciousness. Instead, they felt collaged together, as if several minds had contributed, or as if one mind had fractured and rearranged itself over time. This artifact introduced the notion that identity, like the city itself, might be a construction cobbled together from incompatible parts. Moving forward, the realization struck that every artifact, every clue unearthed, seemed to implicate me in ways both overt and insidious. For instance, a scrap of a photograph tucked between the pages depicted a figure in a rain-soaked alley. My own silhouette, unmistakable in its hunched posture. But the background was a scene I could not recall ever having visited. This prompted a cascade of uneasy questions. Had I been there and suppressed the memory, or had the evidence been planted to frame me? Alternatively, was it possible that my recollection was being subtly tampered with? Each new discovery, a carefully laid trap constructed to erode my sense of self. The sensation was not merely one of being watched, but of being rewritten, as if my history was as mutable as the city's labyrinthine streets. A further complication arose with the arrival of a stranger, a woman whose presence seemed to warp the air around her, drawing attention, yet deflecting scrutiny in the same breath. She introduced herself with a name that felt both familiar and utterly alien, her eyes darting over my face as if searching for a hidden inscription. Her questions were precise, almost surgical in their intent, cutting to the core of anxieties I'd never voiced aloud. She revealed knowledge of events I had yet to experience, referencing decisions I hadn't consciously made, and hinting at consequences lurking just beyond the horizon. In conversation, she would finish my sentences or supply details I didn't realize I had omitted. Her intrusion was neither hostile nor friendly. It was clinical, as though she were an examiner cataloging the progression of an illness. This encounter introduced a new dynamic, the possibility that the investigation was reciprocal, that I was as much an object of study as a seeker of truth. Subsequent attempts to chart the city's geography became exercises in futility. Paths that once led predictably from one landmark to another now doubled back, intersected at impossible angles, or ended abruptly in bricked-up dead ends. Street names morphed between outings, and familiar buildings sometimes vanished entirely, replaced by structures that bore the unmistakable stamp of recent hasty construction. This spatial instability forced a radical re-evaluation of what could be trusted. Now imagine attempting to reconstruct a coherent narrative when the very ground beneath your feet is subject to revision. The city's refusal to conform to logical expectations mirrored the growing instability within my own mind, suggesting that the boundaries separating environment and self had begun to dissolve. The most disquieting aspect emerged in the form of dreams that spilled into waking hours, visions of scenes unfolding in vivid detail, only to be contradicted by the evidence of my senses moments later. These hallucinations were not merely visual. They engaged every sense, compelling me to taste rust on my tongue, hear voices whispering in languages I had never learned, and feel phantom bruises blooming beneath my skin. Each sensory distortion left a residue of doubt, making it impossible to distinguish between memory and fabrication. Confronted with this assault on the integrity of perception, I began to question not just the facts of the case, but the very notion of truth itself. In this new reality, certainty was a luxury long since abandoned, and the pursuit of answers had become an act of self-destruction, each revelation deepening the void rather than illuminating it. Reflecting on this journey so far is akin to standing At the center of a labyrinth, every corridor behind you echoing with the memories of choices made and paths taken, yet the way forward obscured by mist that thickens with each uncertain step. The city's constant rainfall, once merely a backdrop, now feels like a veil drawn over perception itself, a filter through which every color is dulled and every sound is slightly distorted, blurring the distinction between what is outside and what festers within. In such a place, the line between revelation and illusion dissolves. Clarity is a fleeting visitor, elusive and taunting, flickering just beyond reach. Here, understanding is not a treasure waiting at the heart of the maze, but a shifting light that recedes as one draws near, leaving only the residue of longing and the ache of questions deferred. Stepping deeper into this uncertainty, one cannot help but sense the merging of every thread. The city's shifting architecture, the persistent rain, the unreliable memories, the presence of others who seem both real and spectral. Each element, once distinct, now weaves itself into a tapestry that resists unraveling, its patterns suggestive but never fully revealed. The investigator's pursuit, fueled at first by a desire for resolution, now becomes something more primal, a compulsion to chase the echo of meaning, even as each answer threatens to further destabilize the ground beneath their feet. The pursuit of truth, once a straight line, now spirals inward, drawing tighter with every revelation, until the hunter and hunted are no longer separate entities, but reflections caught in a broken mirror. Paranoia, once a shadow at the edge, a vision, becomes the very air breathed, a subtle poison that changes the flavor of every interaction. In this atmosphere, the city itself seems to pulse with a sentience born of secrecy and dread, its facades and alleyways responding to the shifting currents of doubt and fear. The boundaries between self and surroundings blur, so that every gesture, every glance carries the potential for both revelation and deception. The mind, battered by waves of uncertainty and the ceaseless assault of ambiguous clues, becomes a vessel for dreams that bleed into waking life, for memories that rewrite themselves with each new encounter. To move through these streets is to move through one's own mind, tracing the contours of hidden guilt and unspoken terror forever, uncertain whether the next turn will lead to escape or entrapment. As we pivot towards the final reflection, the convergence of these forces takes on a gravity that cannot be denied. The relentless search for meaning, the dissolution of certainty, the city's shifting face, all coalesce into a moment of suspension, a quiet inhalation before the storm's release. The question is no longer simply what the answers are, but whether answers themselves have any stable existence in a world built on shifting ground. Each step forward is a wager, each revelation another layer of obscurity, and the truth, if it exists at all, is a shape glimpsed only in the periphery, always retreating as one advances. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes a matter not of finding resolution, but of enduring the uncertainty, of learning to navigate a terrain where every clue is a double-edged blade and every certainty is a potential snare. The city's rain continues to fall, washing away footprints and erasing borders, leaving behind only the faint impression of passage and the lingering sense that the most profound mysteries are those that refuse to yield, that draw us ever deeper into their embrace. As anticipation collects and the night presses close, the stage is set for a confrontation not just with the external shadows, but with the shifting spectre within. The rain endures, a ceaseless baptism that neither absolves nor cleanses, only deepens the stains it touches. In its rhythm, the city breathes, exhaling secrets and inhaling the doubts of those who wander its fractured streets. The search for truth, once a beacon in the fog, dissolves into something more ambiguous, a hunger that cannot be sated, a pursuit that reveals only the shifting shadows of our own designs. Each answer, instead of closing a door, opens a dozen. More corridors spiraling outward and inward until the distinction between within and without is hopelessly blurred. In this labyrinth, we are both architect and captive, fashioning our own cages from the questions we dare to ask. Yet, there is a strange clarity that emerges from the heart of uncertainty. When every familiar landmark betrays you, when memory itself becomes suspect, and the very ground quivers beneath your step, what remains is a confrontation with the raw architecture of the self. Stripped of certainty, the mind becomes a mirror, sometimes cracked, sometimes clouded, always reflecting back the trembling outline of what we most fear to see. The terror is not in the city's secrets, nor in the inscrutable intentions of others, but in the recognition that we are complicit in our own undoing. Every clue, every pattern we chase is a thread woven from our own anxieties and desires, and the deeper we pursue them, the more intimately we become tangled in their design. To endure this is not to conquer fear, but to exist with it, to move through the rain-soaked streets, knowing that every reflection might be a mask, every certainty a lure. There is a kind of bitter grace in this acceptance, a humility that arises when the world refuses to resolve itself into neat answers. Perhaps the greatest horror is not that we are lost, but that we are perpetually searching, compelled by an instinct older than memory to press forward regardless. In this light, the act of questioning becomes its own form of courage, not because it delivers us from the labyrinth, but because it insists on movement even when the path is obscured. The city will never yield all its secrets, nor will the mind surrender its riddles. What lingers is the sensation of being watched, not by some external intelligence, but by the ever-present possibility of our own transformation. The blood on our hands is not proof of guilt or innocence, but a testament to the boundaries we have crossed in pursuit of meaning. The rain will continue to fall, indifferent to our revelations, and the neon will flicker long after we have vanished from these streets. Yet in the spaces between certainty and doubt, in the hush before the next footstep, there is the possibility of seeing ourselves, not as heroes or victims, but as witnesses to the endless shifting story that is both our cage and our creation. The serve. True practice begins now, to inhabit the question, to walk the maze with open eyes, and to accept that every answer is but another door, another descent. In this, there is no final arrival, only the ongoing dance with uncertainty, and the quiet, persistent courage it demands. The rain is not ending, and neither are you. Rain pressed itself against the city like a suffocating shroud, each droplet, and carving its own cold path down the warped glass of the apartment window. The neon outside glared through the streaks, pale blue, sickly pink, a pulse that never matched the rhythm of a living heart. In this city, the night was a second skin, slick with secrets, and the streets below ran with reflections that twisted everything familiar into something unrecognizably sinister. Every footstep echoed with the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was always listening, always watching. There were no shadows here, only the gaudy, lurid light and the stains it couldn't quite conceal. Inside the room, the air clung to the walls, thick with the metallic scent of old blood and rain-soaked concrete. The desk was a battlefield of crumpled notes, faded photographs and message fragments, each one a wound, each one a promise of answers that never quite arrived. The city's voice was the drip of water in darkened hallways, the static hiss of broken radios, the low moan of the wind funneling through alleys. Out there, beneath the constant drizzle, someone was writing a story in flesh and fear, and all I could do was chase after the smeared ink, hoping the next word wasn't my own name. I had been chasing this killer for weeks, or maybe years. The calendar on the wall told only lies. The days smeared into each other like the faces I passed on the street. Every clue I uncovered was a piece of a puzzle that seemed to change shape as soon as I touched it. The messages, left behind, scratched into bathroom mirrors, painted in phosphorescent streaks on underpass walls, whispered through payphone static, were never answers, never even questions. They were reflections of my own confusion, warped and thrown back at me with a cruel, knowing smile. Every time I thought I had caught the thread, it unraveled, and I was left with only the sensation of falling through someone else's nightmare. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought visions that clung to me long after I woke. I would see myself in places I didn't remember, hands stained with something darker than rainwater, faces looming out of the fog that I recognized but could not name. Sometimes I heard footsteps following me, measured and relentless, always just out of sight. Other times, I caught glimpses of myself in windows distorted by the rain, a stranger's eyes looking back, hollow and hungry. The city itself seemed to conspire, its buildings leaning in, its streets looping back on themselves, as if guiding me somewhere I was never meant to find. What drove me wasn't justice, at least not anymore. It was something rawer, older, a need to understand the shape of the darkness that moved through these streets. The killer was clever, yes, but more than that, they understood the city's language, the way truth could be bent and shattered, how reality itself could be rewritten with enough fear and enough blood. Every step I took, every message I deciphered, only led me deeper into a labyrinth of uncertainty. I felt my grip on the world slipping, memory twisting around itself, days rewinding, words rearranging. Nothing stayed fixed. Even the rain, once a comfort, now sounded like a warning, a code I could almost understand but never quite break.